I've heard a lot about Twilight Princess. On one hand, I've seen people say that it feels rushed, and on the other hand, I know a guy who likes it more than Tears of the Kingdom. Thinking about both of the GameCube Zeldas, the Wind Waker is definitely talked about more often than Twilight Princess, despite Twilight Princess selling more. I also think it's fair to say that the Wind Waker gets a lot more praise and appreciation as a game, and I initially thought that Twilight Princess just wouldn't be that good. Well, I've recently been on a quest to beat every single Zelda game, and I decided that Twilight Princess would be a good place to start. I did put more of a focus on Ocarina of Time and the Minish Cap before Twilight Princess, but this was still one of my first choices, I think. It was around 4 months ago that I decided to start playing Twilight Princess, and after those arduous 4 months, I finally beat the game, and I want to talk about it, so let's talk about Twilight Princess. If we're going to start somewhere, it might as well be with the dungeons. Dungeons are one of the most important aspects of the Zelda series, and Twilight Princess is no exception. There are a total of 9 dungeons that are actually required to beat the game, and, minor spoiler alert, but these are probably my favorite dungeons in the entire Zelda series. The first dungeon, the Forest Temple, isn't the best in the game by any means, but it's still a great way to start the dungeons off. It's a little confusing at times, but I thought the gimmick of collecting all the monkeys was done pretty well and made the temple feel pretty unique. I also found the Gale Boomerang to be quite an interesting weapon, and I thought it was implemented seamlessly throughout the puzzles in the dungeon. There is a big problem though, which is that the Forest Temple is just too long. I think the first dungeon should serve more as an introduction to how dungeons work in the game and less as a fully fledged temple. Maybe this is because it was the first dungeon so it felt longer, but the Forest Temple seemed to be longer than most of the other dungeons in the game, which is weird considering it's the first. This is a problem with Twilight Princess as a whole, which we'll get to later, but let's stay on topic for a second. Ook is a pretty strange mini-boss, not because the gameplay is weird in any way, but let's be real. This guy just looks weird. I don't know how to describe it, he just looks very strange. The boss for the Forest Temple, Daya Baba, is a great introduction boss fight. It's super easy and it's not complicated at all, and having the little monkey come in to help gives it bonus points, at least to me. All in all, the Forest Temple is a pretty neat dungeon. It might not serve a great introduction for most of the dungeons in this game, but on its own, it's not that bad. The second dungeon, Goron Mines, is just the worst dungeon in the game. I'm sorry. Goron Mines isn't even a bad dungeon, and it might still be somewhat enjoyable at times, but there's nothing that really made it stand out for me, and the 2 items for this dungeon are the Iron Boots and the Hero's Bow, some of the most uninteresting items in the game. The Iron Boots are handled in a pretty unique way, and sticking to the ceiling had its moments, but it felt way too slow most of the time, and the bow is, well, the bow. There isn't anything to say about it. I'm not gonna hate on the bow, and I'm not gonna hate on the Iron Boots, but they're honestly just very uninteresting, very boring. Phyrus, the boss for the dungeon, is also, just like the items, pretty boring. Based on what I've played so far, not only does Twilight Princess have my favorite dungeons, but it also has my favorite bosses in the Zelda series, so I don't actually hate Phyrus. But everything wrong with the dungeon can be said for Phyrus as well. He's just too forgettable. From what I remember, you just grab a chain and avoid his attacks, and that's it? You don't really do anything. So, yeah, that's Phyrus. The Goron Mines aren't the best, but what about the next dungeon? The Lakebed Temple is quite a surprise for me because, to be honest, my hopes were not high for a water-themed dungeon, and this dungeon ended up being fantastic. The Claw Shot is a pretty universally awesome item, so that automatically makes the temple pretty good, but the puzzle solving was pretty good as well. The worst part of the Lakebed Temple is definitely the boss, more feel, and to be honest, I don't know how the Zelda games could even incorporate a fun water boss in the first place. I mean, there has to be a way, I just can't think of it. I honestly don't remember much from the Lakebed Temple, so I guess you could say it's forgettable, but I probably forgot because I was sick the entire time and actively working on a terrible video, but all I can remember is that it exceeded my expectations. The fourth dungeon, Arbiter's Grounds, is where the dungeons go from, yeah, these are pretty good, to Okay, these are the best dungeons in Zelda. Let's start off with the negative, because why not? There were a lot of things in the Arbiter's grounds that kind of annoyed me. Fighting Poes and Redeads in particular is a nightmare, and I'm not ever fond of the desert theme for dungeons. Despite this though, the puzzle solving and the boss at the end make up for these small flaws. I was never really confused with this dungeon for too long, but it wasn't easy either, which is a balance that I think a lot of dungeons struggle with. Some dungeons are too easy and completing them doesn't feel as rewarding, and then other dungeons have puzzles that seem so arbitrary that it's nearly impossible to figure them out. The Stalord boss fight is one of the best boss fights in the entire game. It's so good. Riding on the spinner while avoiding obstacles to hit him feels riveting and exciting, and dodging his obstacles on the second stage as you ascend to the top is even better. What's crazy is that despite how good this boss fight is, it isn't even the best boss fight in Twilight Princess. Now we're gonna move on to the next dungeon, but right before that, please subscribe. We're so close to 1,000. And I've made that joke way too much. Alright, back to the video. The fifth dungeon in the game is Snowpeak Ruins, which is even better than Arbiter's Grounds. The ball and chain is honestly a pretty lame item, so we're gonna ignore that, but what makes the dungeon stand out for me isn't necessarily the puzzle solving or the boss fight, but the theming of the dungeon itself. Exploring a beautiful yet ominous and decaying mansion is a really neat idea for an area to explore, and I feel like most dungeons don't feel as unique as this one. Generally, most dungeons feel kinda similar when it comes to the way they're themed, and the Snowpeak Ruins are a great way to make an ice-themed dungeon feel more unique. Also, I love this Yeti guy. I mean, come on, who doesn't? The boss fight for the Snowpeak Ruins is okay, I guess. I mean, it was fun, but it didn't really stick out in my mind as particularly good, so there isn't much to talk about when it comes to this boss. The sixth dungeon in the game is the Temple of Time, and all I'm gonna say is this. The Temple of Time is the best dungeon in the game. The seventh dungeon is the City in the Sky, which, to be honest, is a little bit of a step down compared to the three that came before it. A lot like the Forest Temple, the City in the Sky is just too long. None of the puzzles in this dungeon felt unique, and the same goes for the enemies within the dungeon, so I don't get why this is one of the longest dungeons in the game. Maybe it's even the longest. I usually take on a dungeon one sitting at a time and 2 sittings if it's a little extra long, but for this dungeon I took 3 sittings to complete it. I'm not gonna pretend that there aren't great parts about the City in the Sky though. For example, the double claw shot is one of my favorite items in the game, and I thought that moving around with it was definitely the best part of the dungeon. This was honestly the only time that the game felt like a real platformer, which was very interesting. The boss in the City in the Sky was also, honestly, my favorite boss fight in the entire game. The theming of fighting a large dragon at the highest point in the world made the boss fight seem climactic and important, and even though the boss fight in the gameplay isn't anything crazy on a technical level, the boss fight was incredible. The City in the Sky not only has my favorite boss in the game, but one of my favorite items, so it's a shame that it dragged on for so long. Good thing that this isn't a problem with the game as a whole. Anyway, the final real dungeon, Palace of Twilight, is really overhated. Out of the 9 dungeons in this game, this one definitely gets the most criticism, and while I don't think it's really fair, I guess we can address the arguments anyway. For the most part, people say that this dungeon is too easy, and while it is on the easier side of dungeons, are we really gonna pretend that anything in Twilight Princess is any harder? Twilight Princess is an extremely easy game, so I don't really care about one of the dungeons being slightly easier than most of the other ones. I thought the atmosphere for this dungeon was fantastic. It's probably my favorite atmosphere in the entire game. It felt ominous and creepy like it should, and it didn't drag on for too long. It's true though that aside from the atmosphere, there really isn't anything making this temple stand out from the others. Except there is one thing that makes it stand out for me. The boss. Remember when I said like a minute ago that the dragon guy was my favorite boss in the game? Well, I consider it a tie between this guy and Zant. The Zant boss fight is just a collection of the previous boss fights executed perfectly. The fight begins as a tame and simple boss fight, but gradually devolves as Zant becomes more frustrated. It's clear throughout the fight that Zant doesn't have like any real skill in combat, and he's just using the abilities that he's been gifted by Ganon. Really, if I'm being honest, I just loved listening to the soundtrack throughout this boss fight, and that's half of the reason I liked it so much. But going back to the Palace of Twilight, I really don't understand the hate for it, and I loved it a lot. The final dungeon is Hyrule Castle, which is a pretty good dungeon, and there isn't really anything else to say. The final boss in the game was pretty good, but I honestly didn't care for it as much as the final boss in Ocarina of Time or Tears of the Kingdom. Twilight Princess has the most consistent lineup of dungeons that I've ever experienced so far, but this video can't be all about the dungeons, so let's move on and talk about the story. The story in Twilight Princess is very surprising to me because I would say that it actually serves as a good story on its own. Link's adventure is pretty standard. He starts out as a small boy in a small village and gradually becomes a legendary hero over the course of the game. The character that the story actually focuses on is Midna. Throughout most of my playthrough, I couldn't really understand why so many people appreciated Midna as a character because, I'm gonna be honest, I hated Midna through most of the game. I always thought that she treated Link poorly for no reason and assumed it would stay that way, but her character arc throughout the game was actually pretty good. At first, she has no intention in actually helping Link and all she wants to do is further her goals and leave Link behind, but as the game goes on, she realizes that Link is too baller to betray in good conscience. It sounds really generic, doesn't it? The character initially doesn't care about the main character, but eventually ends up feeling attached to the main character and decides not to betray them. Sounds pretty basic to me, but I don't know, I still thought it was done really well. I assume this happened to most people, but I went from hating Midna in the beginning of the game to actually liking her character by the end. At the end of the day, Twilight Princess is really about Midna. Sure, it says Zelda in the title, but she only really shows up like twice throughout the entire game, and they really should have called this game something like The Legend of Midna, Twilight Princess, because honestly it would make more sense. The story features two villains, Ganondorf and Zant, and we'll talk about Zant first. Throughout most of the game, Zant seems like the important villain. He acts completely stoic and seems like a truly strong opponent, but as we all know, Zant turns out to be a deranged lunatic. I think his boss fight perfectly symbolizes his character throughout the game, so let's go back to that for a second. During the earlier parts of the boss fight, he isn't even trying. He seems relatively composed, and he thinks that he'll easily be able to beat Link. As the fight goes on, however, he realizes that beating Link isn't going to be as easy as he thought, and he starts taking further measures in an attempt to beat him, and by the end of the fight, he's completely unhinged. This is the music during the beginning of the fight. Sounds pretty calm, sounds pretty collected, right? Well, let's listen to the soundtrack by the end of the fight. Yeah, Zant is completely unhinged. Zant is a fantastic villain, but I do wish that his insanity was built up or at least hinted at a little bit more throughout the game. His deranged rant at the end of the Palace of Twilight seemed slightly awkward since there were no hints or really anything that could tell the player that he was insane in the first place. I still loved the twist, but I thought it could have been done a little bit better. I loved Zant as a villain, and quite honestly, I liked him a little bit more than Ganondorf in this game. Ganondorf in Twilight Princess doesn't seem to have much of a personality at all. Yeah, he's cool, but similar to Zelda, he doesn't get much screen time, and there's literally nothing else to say about him. He served his purpose, but I do think it would have been cool to see Ganondorf more than once throughout the game. My biggest issue with this story, and Twilight Princess as a whole, is that I feel like it drags on for too long. A lot of Twilight Princess felt like I was just doing a checklist of repeatable errands throughout most of the game, especially early on. The Tears of Light segments are so boring and they go on forever. I can understand that exploring the Twilight Realm can be made interesting, but forcing the player to go on an Easter egg hunt 3 times in a row just isn't fun. The first time I searched for the Tears of Light, I was already bored out of my mind, but I did give it a pass because I enjoyed the novelty of the Twilight Realm. The problem is that the novelty began to wear off by the time I even decided to do the second Tears of Light challenge, and there are 3 of them. Apparently the HD version of Twilight Princess actually reduced the number of tears you have to collect, which could have been great for me, but I was playing on the original version of the game, not the HD version. All I'm saying is that if they had to decrease the amount of tears in the remaster, then clearly there was something wrong with the Tears of Light segments in the original. This problem isn't exclusive to the Tears of Light segments though. I rarely struggled on any puzzles, and when I did, I looked it up on a walkthrough. I only died like 15 times, I did literally 0 side quests, and the game still took me 32 hours to beat. I can take my time and enjoy a long game, but I really felt like Twilight Princess relied a lot on backtracking and revisiting areas that I've already explored. There are 9 dungeons in Twilight Princess, and in Ocarina of Time there are 9 dungeons and 2 mini dungeons, and yet Ocarina of Time takes 10 hours less. Why? Because Ocarina of Time doesn't put a bunch of filler in between its dungeons. As I've said before, I absolutely love the dungeons in Twilight Princess, even more so than Ocarina of Time, so I don't see an issue with the dungeons being less spread out throughout the game, and I felt like they should have done that. I really did hate a lot of the in-between plot and the in-between characters in Twilight Princess. I don't care for Ilia, or Telma, or most of the other strange characters that Link has the displeasure of meeting, but the story as a whole was still done pretty well, and it felt pretty satisfying near the end. It's actually really interesting to have a story focused on Link's companion, and I thought it was done pretty well. I do wish that Zelda had a bigger part to play, but her absence really didn't negatively impact the story as a whole. The dungeons and the story are the most important aspects of Twilight Princess, but I want to go over some of the less important stuff as well, so let's do that very quickly. The music is pretty good, not as good as Ocarina of Time or Tears of the Kingdom or The Wind Waker, but I still liked it a lot. I thought it was pretty interesting, and apparently it gets a lot of hate, which I don't understand. The gameplay when compared to every other 3D and 2D Zelda is just far superior. This is definitely my favorite combat system in Zelda, and I'm honestly surprised with how good it is. Wolf Link gets a lot of hate, but honestly I thought Wolf Link was pretty fun, and it really wasn't that intrusive. So I don't know why so many people hate on it. And finally, from the sounds of it, the HD version of Twilight Princess is a lot better, so whenever I revisit the game, I'll try playing it on the HD version instead. Twilight Princess is an unforgettable and great experience, and I would definitely recommend this game to anybody who likes any other Zelda game. The bosses, characters, for the most part, dungeons, and art style were all fantastic, but I do think there's too much filler content in between the dungeons for me to consider it a masterpiece. Twilight Princess is a fantastic game, and I'm sure we'll be getting a port of this game on the Nintendo Switch. Right?